it's difficult to categorize or to describe the approach of Evgeny. He sometimes mentioned as a critique of technology, a critique of the internet. Others is defined as a critique of capitalism. But I like to describe him, and this is the reason why I choose him as other authors in my book, is because I think he's one of the most prominent thinkers of our century, and I think that his research about the connection between technology and capitalism are very useful for understanding our present. I'm going to make him some questions. For that, I would like to introduce a bit the work of Evgeny. 7 years ago, he published 2 books. He was 24, 25, if I'm not mistaken, criticizing the internet and criticizing a solutionist vision about technology. So all the problems of the world could be solved with some technologies and a bit of political or a bit of an intelligent approach to politics. But from that time to nowadays, what we saw is a radical approach to technology, a research of the foundations of our economic thought, research about the structure of capitalism, which are the implications of the development of the new technologies. One of the main approach, and apparently new, was his conceptualization of digital feudalism or high-tech feudalism that was proposed by Evgeny 2 years ago. And so I would like to start making you a question about why do you depart from that assumption of some kind of digital feudalism, and also which is your critique that is now more clear against rentism.
Okay, well, thank you very much for coming and for the questions and for the high praise that you've offered to me in the introduction. I must confess, it's a bit weird for me to be in this position, because normally at book presentations we're supposed to talk about your book and not about mine. So I will make sure that you don't get off the hook so easily just by posing all the questions to me, and that I will pose you some questions of my own. I must say that I do speak some Spanish, so I have looked at it. I haven't read it entirely, but I have flipped through it enough to know that you do cite me a lot there. So, you have probably engaged with my work over the years almost as profoundly, or maybe even more profoundly, than I have myself. I have discovered references to papers and essays that I have forgotten about, that I have written. So that was very encouraging to see. And let's just make sure that we don't go down, because you clearly know my work really well, and I'm not sure about the others, and maybe the others here are also here to hear about you and your work. So I don't want us to go down this very narrow path. I will answer the question, but I will also try to situate it in a broader debate about technology today. So from where I stand, there are basically 2 dominant ways to talk about technology. And you can see them playing out now when people talk about big data, or they talk about artificial intelligence, or they talk about 5G. And those are either deeply moralistic discussions, which essentially frame everything as a question of good and evil, technology being a force for good or force for bad, and there is this constant conversation about humanity versus technology, machine versus the man, and it's a very traditional way to talk and think that's been with us for centuries. And there is, I think, more and more so, a technocratic way to talk about it, and the technocratic way, by and large, is rooted in the language of economics. So we look at Amazon or we look at Google and we say, they are monopolists, that they're abusing market power, they have accumulated too much of it, we need to make them smaller, we need to break them up, we need to break up the data, and it's kind of, it's an approach which tends to reduce technology just to the questions of how can you regulate it better. So it's kind of a weird mix of legalism and economism. And what I have been, which kind of takes everything as given, by the way, and that to me is a very important point. It starts on the assumption that we have already arrived at the perfect form of the state. The state should be exactly how it was conceived by Bismarck in the 19th century. There should be a very large bureaucratic force charged with bureaucracy and enforcement of rules. There have to be markets, we have to police those markets to make sure that they remain competitive, and citizens, in as much as we acknowledge their existence, are there to occasionally vote for parties, but mostly participate in public life through consumption. So they participate in the market, they make decisions, and more or less technology is there to tell them that they have new needs and to satisfy those needs. Right, so this is the second legalistic economistic approach kind of expanded into a more sophisticated theory. What I have been doing over the last 3, 4, 5 years was trying to develop another way to talk about technology that on the one hand would not kind of completely collapse into this deeply philosophical language of morality, humanity versus technology, man versus the machine. But on the other hand, it would not operate with some pre-given, pre-existing categories. It would not say that, well, we know that in the past we have operated monopolies this way, so we need to break them up as we did 100 years ago. We need to put an equivalent to the New Deal of some kind, but for the digital sector, we need to put a new type of bureaucratic class to basically write rules for Google and Facebook, and citizens will continue doing what they have been doing so far, which is interact with those firms as consumers, as people who pay to install an app, who pay to use a service, and we do not actually seek to integrate this question of technology into the broader socio-political debate we are having, and have been having for the last 15, 20 years. Which, is a debate about how can we structure the relationship between the citizen and the political party, between the political party and the state, between the firm and the state, to what extent the relationship between the firm and the state has become unhealthy because businesses with their lobbyists, for example, tend to dominate the political process. And we've been having those debates. Those debates are not imaginary. And they barely interact with our questions about how technology should function, who should own it, should it be owned by citizens, should it be owned by governments, should it be owned by the government of Saudi Arabia with its very big and large sovereign wealth fund, which is now the largest investor into companies like Uber, or should it be run, operated, and maybe invested into by smaller players, municipalities, collectives of citizens, neighborhoods, and so forth. For me, those are all political questions. And as I tried to open them, it became obvious to me that there are some structural barriers and obstacles in the path, that the majority of newspapers and the majority of conferences and the majority of media, they would really prefer to stick to one of these other two narratives because they are so much more convenient, because you already have the certainty that this question of the man versus the machine, it will never go away from the public agenda. And so the question of, how can we create another bureaucratic, technocratic class to manage these new companies, right? Without actually questioning to what extent something like artificial intelligence should be considered to be infrastructure. Should it be considered public good, to which everybody should be entitled to have access on equal rights? Or should it be considered some kind of a commodity, which those of us who can afford to get it, we can get it in the marketplace, and those of us who can't, well, will have to be left out, right? And the path in which we're in right now does provide those answers. and it does assume that artificial intelligence is a commodity, and firms like Amazon or Google or Microsoft can offer it as a service to paying clients, and everybody else will be left out. And for me, answering this question this way, sleepwalking almost into the answer, without thinking about it coherently, without articulating it as a political question that political forces can answer and debate, to me it all but ensures that the future will be owned and shaped by this new class of tech overlords, you can put it that way. Now, you can of course say that the emergence of this new class of intermediaries, which to some extent you can argue they become more powerful than governments, they are extremely profitable, they have tons of data which even governments don't have, they can make decisions which affect governments. You know, Facebook can make a decision whether you are entitled to speech or not entitled to speech, to what extent, or at least on its platform, right? Of course it will not come to your house and keep you quiet there, but in as much as you would like to express something on Instagram, WhatsApp, or Facebook, which are the dominant platforms in which society communicates, Facebook is the de facto private regulator of freedom of expression. Right? And you can find many such examples where, you know, more and more of decisions that were, and kind of choices and life paths that were previously embedded into the paradigm of law and the paradigm of rights, to which you were entitled because they were written and granted by the Constitution, these rights have been almost silently cancelled away, and instead we go out into this paradigm of permissions, and a lot of analysts and intellectuals to draw the obvious analysis, and the obvious analysis would in fact be to feudalism. I mean, feudalism was an immense concentration of private power in the hands of actors that more or less were not in any way responsible or accountable to the state and to political democratic institutions which were voted on by citizens. Citizens did not even vote at the time, right? So there are a lot of people now, and I was one of them 3 years ago, who were in fact framing this issue as a question of a return to a techno-feudalism of some kind. Right? And my disagreement and reluctance to follow down that path, I mean, it has many origins, but one of those origins is that I essentially think that to describe what we currently see emerging as techno-feudalism would be at the same time to draw a very utopian picture of what capitalism itself is. You know, for me, capitalism has never been, so, you know, this kind of debate we've been having for the last 15 years that capitalism and democracy inevitably go together, that somehow you need democracy in place with rule of law, defense of rights to freedom of expression, some political freedoms, you know, the argument that all those conditions are somehow conducive to capitalism and that once you remove them, capitalism will fall apart. I never bought into that argument. And for me, the fact that capitalists would like to accumulate private power and make sure that they displace and replace as much of non-market activity as possible and convert it into market activity, reducing activities, services, and goods to the level of the status of commodity, to me, it's kind of almost the raison d'etre of capitalism. Right? It's not a deviation and it's not some kind of a pathology which emerges only now because there are these tech giants that would like to make money off everything, and especially off our everyday life. So from that perspective, my resistance to use the term feudalism in describing the current conjuncture, it's very simple. It just has to do with the fact that it seems like a whitewashing operation for capitalism itself. I mean, there is absolutely no reason not to stick to the traditional categories that we have inherited from the past in order to understand the current situation. And in fact, you know, what has been missing in our analysis of Silicon Valley and in our analysis of the digital economy was precisely this deeply historicized approach, which would be able to present Silicon Valley not just a bunch of geniuses wearing flip-flops and working in garages and drinking, you know, smoothies in Palo Alto, but would present Silicon Valley as a kind of almost a natural product of forces like Pentagon, Wall Street, Hollywood, to some extent, the military-industrial complex, and the broader Cold War environment, which created the funding institutions, risk-taking institutions, the kind of private-public collaboration that fueled that industry. And the story that we get instead in the media and the popular histories of big tech is that it's all about entrepreneurs, and government has always been a hindrance, and of course, it's not always been a hindrance. Very often it's been the catalyst. Right? So to give this, very long answer to a question, the final sentence in conclusion, for me, the talk of digital feudalism, it's a categorical and analytical mistake. That we gain very little from it. I mean, the imperatives of capitalism, and of which the chief to me is profitability, and it's the need to basically survive in the face of intense competition. They've never went anywhere. I mean, we're not back, even though many people on the kind of neoliberal right would tell you that capitalism that we have now is political capitalism, right? That all of the privileges and secure markets that companies enjoy, that those markets are guaranteed by the state, right? So we have a quasi-monopoly in many industries where politicians, because they're so corrupt, they grant these rights to the companies. And you find that discourse done by many politicians in Europe and elsewhere. I just don't necessarily buy that. I mean, all of that exists, but at a broader global level, any of those firms, no matter how corrupt they are, they're still subject to competition from China, to competition from India. They are subject to the global interest rate environment. They cannot borrow money cheaper and more expensive than anybody else. So the traditional features of capitalism, the existence of capital markets, the ability to borrow, borrowing to invest, to derive profit, all of that is still there. It's very perverse because clearly, the effects of quantitative easing have been quite mixed and ambiguous on how capitalism works. I mean, there are all sorts of pathologies in capitalism itself, but none of those pathologies amounts to anything that would justify the label feudalism. And to do it solely on the fact that a couple of private players have suddenly become so powerful and they use that power to decide on how the rest of us lives their lives. I mean, that's how capitalism has always been. I mean, much of it has been limited to the workplace, which has traditionally been run as a tyranny, and it's only because of the workers' movement that you manage to somehow tame that tyranny. But these tyrannical exercises of private power, they're not antithetical to capitalism, they are at its core. And I think that people who make these arguments about digital feudalism, very often they just have very poor grasp of the history of capitalism, of its actual operations. And it's not to somehow present an anti-capitalist reading of it. You can agree with everything I've just said and still say that, well, but it's still better than the alternatives, right? And many people say that. So again, there is not necessarily any political baggage attached to it. It's just that feudalism is a very different beast, and the features of capitalism that we describe as feudalism are actually features of capitalism. That's a very long answer to a question.
When I talk here in the book about awakening of the technological dream, and I put as an example the journalist, I'm talking about them as a class, some people that are fighting against some techno-capitalists. They can be called Google or they can be called Facebook. On your analysis, now that you are offering some answers to which is the form of capitalism today, to that class that you were describing, I would like you to talk or to answer about which is in this scenario the conflict between capital and labor, that it's also very old.
Well, I don't know. I'm not just looking at people whether they really like to hear my take on capital and labor, but okay, I'll take that risk. Well, I have a somewhat heterodox perspective on this question. In that, I'm not sure how theoretical I should get, but capitalists, to me, let's put aside the question of capital and capitalism, but capitalists, they are driven by one thing, as I said, and that one thing is long-term profitability. How do you ensure long-term profitability? You ensure it by building a product that everybody wants, or lowering costs, so that in the long term your costs are lower than your competitors. No matter how good your product is, if in the long term your costs are very high, you'll be dead, because somebody else will come up with the same product and will offer it cheaper. And that's sort of at the global level how the system works. That's why China has achieved what it did in the last 2 or 3 decades. You can, of course, lower costs by a number of factors, right? You can lower costs by exploiting workers in the factory, but you can also lower costs differently. You can pretend that there is absolutely no cost attached to the use of natural resources, right? Because ultimately we do not have a way to price them adequately, so you can say they're free, right? Do you reduce costs that way? Sure you do. Do you reduce them in a way that you would normally recognize as part of the conflict between capital and labor? Perhaps not, right? Because our eyes and our analytics and our optics are so often trained on exploitation in the workplace for good reasons and historical reasons, and some of them are theoretical and analytical reasons, that we tend to, and especially Orthodox Marxists, tend to kind of dismiss that out of the gate and just say, no, we just want to focus on labor. And my bet is that big tech, it presents, this sector presents a very different challenge than labor-intensive industries, which actually have, by labor-intensive, I mean actual wage labor, industries that actually have to go and hire employees. If you look at big tech, they have built a fantastic set of services, but a lot of those services are based on their ability to appropriate inputs cheaper. Just like some oil firm or energy firm might have gone and claimed an oil well as its own, or take it from native people of, Latin America. Here, you have a bunch of firms that manage to convince us that data belongs to them, that data is not an asset, that it's not a public good, that it's nothing, it's just something that flows through the networks, but we'd better not talk about it. And they manage to expand into many corners of our everyday life, and they manage to basically find a way to put those activities as inputs into their business models. Which, again, if you think about those processes and with the traditional categories of labor, for me, you have 2 options here. You can say that we all work for these firms because they derive some value from us, or you can just say that, well, they still derive some value from us even if we don't work for them. It's a philosophical debate, which has some substance, but in the big picture, I think it matters not so much. Ultimately, what we need is the ability to understand how the system and the key players in it, the capitalist firms, how it manages to perpetuate itself, right? And if you understand how it manages to perpetuate itself by offloading costs on others, by using marketing political power of the firms to prevent any regulations from springing up, you will understand that there are many, many ways to cut costs, of which labor is not one. So it, of course, from then on, it leads to a very tough set of conversations you need to be having with the labor movement, with trade unions, and with others, because if you do start from the assumption that labor is not the only party that's hurt, or that's not the only party that's hurt the most in the process of capitalist production, then it's not obvious why there should be the central element in it. You could, of course, make the case that under industrial capitalism, they were the most exploited part, and some formula, some people have gone into very bizarre directions with this insight. But it's not obvious to me that in the high-tech sector, if you just look at it nationally, that would be the case. Of course, you still have a lot of production happening in Bangladesh, Vietnam, China, Cambodia, and there it's kind of industrial capitalism on steroids. But I wouldn't just, again, dismiss the sufferings, which of course are very different sufferings, of people in the more developed parts of the world who, while not being directly exploited in the workplace, are still being robbed of something, right? And you can, of course, take the orthodox line and that something is surplus value, labor, blah, blah, blah. You can say that it's just the future. just the ability of build a future with modern information technology that will not be dominated by hierarchy, they will be dominated by centralization, they will be dominated by resource scarcity, pollution, and all those things, which at this current juncture, information technology reinforces. You can instead say that, well, we have this wonderful tool which allows us to do magical things. You can have cars that drive without drivers. I mean, it's not bad as a start. You can cure a lot of diseases. You can do a lot of things with it. It's a life-transforming technology. It's a life-transforming possibility which would allow us to structure our life and our social coordination entirely differently. And we are squandering it right now on teaching systems to recognize faces of cats or cows or whatever it is that they need to manage a farm more productively. Right? So from that perspective, you would need an entirely new vocabulary, an entirely new way, a theoretical framework also, which you can of course reconcile with Marxism, and you can even reconcile it with not so much the theories of value of Marxist thought, but with its ideas on how capitalist competition functions. I'm not necessarily too interested in making that bridge, but yeah, that's what I would say. Sorry, maybe I gave you a very different answer from what you expected, but why don't you tell us more about the conflict, especially how it's playing out in the media and journalistic sphere?
When I was talking that it was difficult to conceptualize Evgeny because there is, can be said that a leftist thinker, but not a Marxist one or not an orthodox one, probably could be described as an extremist of theory. So I will try to answer you now. What I see and what I see capitalism or how the mode of production influence or it's a theory, the Marxist theory is a good approach to that, is in the conflict between a journalist that needs to indexate a lot of content into the infrastructure of Google, that need to produce a lot, and also in this case Google gets a lot of surplus value from each journalist. And I think that this not only is a conflict between capital and labor, but there is also another transformation behind this that is something as basic as the press machine or the kind of technology for communication that was as old as modernity or as old as capitalism, and the destruction of this machine, or I think that gives us a very important new or a very important announce of the world in which we are living, and the things that we should do to politicize it. You were describing about the logics of profitability. When we have those logics of capitalism, long-term profitability against news media, for example, against newspapers, they see these big firms, they see the newspapers or this industry as competitors that they need to kill, because capitalism is like a war. Some people survive, and others not. No? And I see that journalists or this industry is one of those losers of that. And also these logics of capitalism nowadays are not compatible with the logics of democracy. Not because I think that journalists are the main tool for democracy. I don't trust that. I think it's a liberal approach to how we understand information and public debate. But I think that it's not compatible to think about the logic of capitalism today. They are not the same as the logics of democracy. I think that there is a kind of bifurcation. We can say that democracy loses this fight, and it's also I try to go further than also a fight between classes. Something more is behind. In the book, I talk about knowledge ecosystem, some kind of ecosystem where we are all connected, we are producing data, And even if I don't have Facebook, because I don't have Facebook, a friend has Facebook, he produced data, and Facebook can offer a service to the government that is going to hurt me, even if I don't have Facebook. So that's the reason about talking about this knowledge, or this ecosystem of knowledge, to question, or to make you a question about if we cannot talk about a mode of production as such. You sometimes call the internet or the World Wide Web as a digital or a global infrastructure, a digital infrastructure that now is global. And I would like you to talk about that, because if we are seen as this kind of ecosystem, the value is not only came from labor, but it came from other places. I would like to also talk about the other approach to this infrastructure, and to think it as a public good.
Well, I mean, infrastructures can be of very different kinds. I mean, the Germans ran a very efficient train infrastructure in the 1930s, but it was not for the benefit of humanity. It was run. So, I mean, the infrastructure, that word itself, it does not imply, to me at least, nothing positive in itself. But again, to reduce it to a very banal, maybe talking point that I keep repeating, for me, capitalism is about one thing, and that thing is assured long-term profits. How do you do that? You have to figure it out. Maybe you have to do it by making sure that there is not enough discontent in the streets, and people don't start erupting the normal and disrupting the normal operations of businesses, like we've seen in France with the Yellow Vests movement. That clearly had a very big impact on the bottom line of the French economy. And the very first comment, I think, from the French government that Bruno Le Maire, the job does he have now, the finance minister, I think, he actually went on the record saying that, well, this protests, they're very bad because they're going to eat like 1.3% of our GDP, so you guys should stop, as if that was the right language to talk to. But clearly, if you can find a way to pacify people in mass, and to prevent such eruptions of spontaneous protest driven by concerns about politics and whatnot, which, of course, Spain is not new to these eruptions, that will clearly, in the long term, be good for short, long-term profitability. Right? So here, for you, is one infrastructure. If you carry a phone in your pocket, and the phone tracks your location, and it understands everything you've been doing, and just when it senses that your level of anger is about to go through the roof and erupt, it sends you a message saying that, well, remember your mortgage. It might become more expensive if the police detain you. It clearly sends a very powerful message that in the long term plays to the advantage of those who would rather minimize dissent and any possibility of any quasi or nearly revolutionary change. Right? So the infrastructures that we have put in place, they're not just for production, and they're not just for some kind of Habermasian communication among people with the best argument. They are also infrastructures of suppressing knowledge. You can't imagine how many financial but also energy firms that are out there trying to game Google search results in order to hide certain results about their activity, right? So, the production of ignorance have become a full-blown industry in itself. Not just journalism, right, which to some extent also produces quite a lot of ignorance, but you actually have firms, of which probably Cambridge Analytica and its parent company, they're a very good example, whose whole job it is to make sure that instead of truth, we get this ignorance in place, and they do it at industrial scale with all of the modern technologies. And they innovate quite a bit in what they do. So this question of infrastructure, I think it can be quite tricky. I'm not saying that that's the only type of infrastructure we have, but unfortunately, some of the infrastructures that are currently in place, they are the direct consequence of not having a political economy approach to digital economy or digitization. If you were really to start with a political economy approach, you would try to understand, okay, maybe the reason why we have fake news is not because there are Kremlin hackers manipulating our networks, but maybe it's because the way in which internet platforms are incentivized to basically maximize the number of views for any piece of content that they carry. It's as simple as that. If Facebook and Twitter and Google and others make the most money from maximizing the number of people who sees a post, regardless of whether the post is true or not, we do not have a robust infrastructure in place for producing knowledge. We have an infrastructure in place for producing ignorance. And if you were to answer that question with a true political economic perspective, what we would like to do would be to disconnect the existing infrastructure from the pressure to maximize eyeballs and page views and connect it to a different logic, which would not be about advertising, but would be about maybe subsidizing that communication with taxes or fees or payments of some kind. You would like to disconnect it from this idea that all that matters is how many eyes, how many eyeballs have seen a given piece of content. And we kind of knew that. If you look at the rationale, I don't know how that story played out here in Spain after the transition, but in Northern Europe, if you look at, even if Southern Europe to some extent, if you look at Italy and a few other countries, you've had public media emerge precisely for that purpose. The reason why we had public television in Germany or in Sweden, to some extent in Italy, was precisely because the private providers of television or radio were not trusted to essentially supply the news in a manner that was unbiased, because their business models and the fact that they always had to sell advertising were assumed to somehow be corrupting of knowledge and truth. This is why they set up all these public institutions that were supposed to be funding public media, right? And we just never extended that model to a much more consequential part of our society, which was the digital infrastructure, which powers not just the media and the journalism, but powers also the economy, transportation, energy, health, and everything else. So it's much bigger in its ramifications and its consequences.
And I think I got that idea into practice there. You were talking about Spain. We have some kind of public media, but as we've seen with another kind of infrastructures that you were talking about, telecommunications or energy ones or transport ones, they were not privatized as such. Mm-hmm. For example, Aznar, that neocon leader of the Popular Party, said one time that he cannot manage to privatize the public television. Mm-hmm. But he managed to privatize all the other infrastructure. So I would like to answer you, which is the opportunity now to politicize this kind of technological infrastructure, to go again to that fight in favor of not only nationalization, but to get the control of other public infrastructures, as energy, as transport, as such. And recently, you in a paper you talk about that feedback in infrastructure, and you see it as a future political battle or a place to fight for the future of us. Can you talk a bit about that?
Yes, well, I think if we start on the assumption that there are certain dynamics built into modern international capitalist system, which basically makes it almost impossible for governments not to privatize things. Because, and the reasons are not, they're all reasonable. They're not invented. Tax base is shrinking. You either enter tax competition with Malta or Cyprus or the Netherlands, where the tax rates are far smaller than in Spain, let alone in Italy or Germany, or you risk that foreign capital will flow there. It's quite a big, it's quite a big factor. You should not discount this. 30 or 40 years ago, it was much easier to basically to collect taxes. I mean, if you don't have that, your tax base is shrinking, so you constantly need to find new sources of investment. And you can, of course, go and borrow, and maybe with the low interest rates that we have now, borrowing is not the worst possible choice, but the government debt that we have already accumulated is already staggering. So, the more you take on, the higher your debt service charges, so it's almost a vicious circle. So the governments that are even of center-left persuasion, I'm not talking about Spain, talking about Portugal, where the government is much more clearly defined as a center-left, if not leftist government, they can't do anything because, they are locked inside the same international financial capitalist system as everybody else. So for them, to be a good socialist now is to basically keep the budgets balanced and keep the deficits low. So it's almost the reversal of the Keynesian paradigm, but it's not an ideological reversal of it. It's just the reality that if they really want to start paying less for their debt service to all of the creditors that borrowed money to Portugal, they basically need to do everything in their power to spend less, to privatize, and to do all those nasty things that we like to oppose. And I can give you the answer about the technology bit of it, but ultimately, without solving the question of where the money is going to come from, the same dynamics, they will remain in place. I mean, I don't buy this cheap leftist rhetoric that all of those privatizations are driven by special interests and we can reverse and stop all of them and everything will just go back to how it was in the 1980s. I mean, to me, it's not, some of that might be true, but those pressures that exist on many governments, they're not artificial, right? And they're not artificial to anybody who has ever looked at the actual budgets and public deficits and what to do about them. Now, of course, you can say we need to have higher taxes, blah, 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 but again, this is easier said than done because capital, unfortunately, is mobile. So if you really want to increase taxes, you really need to make sure that investors who have come in and invested into Spain would not pack and leave to Portugal, which, would offer them a more favorable tax environment. And unfortunately, without having a common European strategy for cracking down on tax evasion, for reducing mobility of capital, for making it harder for countries like Luxembourg or Ireland or the Netherlands to essentially serve as legalized tax havens inside the European Union, I don't think that any infrastructural policy other than privatization is possible. It's hard to do. Even in Germany, a country that's very rich, has balanced budgets, the infrastructure is terrible. It's trembling, it's collapsing, and it's collapsing for the same set of reasons that they're just afraid that given the current political and international trade and economic situation, putting billions and tens of billions into infrastructure in the long term is going to cost them a lot of damage. Of course, you can criticize them for it, and a lot of German economists have done so, but it's not entirely an unreasonable position. I just don't think that the answer to it, as I said, lies in somehow trying to find some salvation by technology. So you're going to say that, well, fine, everything is bad, our tax base is shrinking, capital is leaving, we basically have to be dictated the terms by the credit rating agencies and we cannot do anything. But hey, there is artificial intelligence, there is AI, there is sharing economy, there is gig economy, there is big data, and that's a new source of wealth, which we are now going to tap and turn it into a new booming economy, which will compensate for all of those other negative factors. And that to me seems to be the kind of operating model of a lot of parties on both on the center left and the center right. I think you've seen it, maybe you've even tweeted or responded to that message that there was a slogan from Partido Popular which said something like, we need to digitize our health system, which, where 10 years ago they would say we need to privatize it. Now they just say we need to digitize it, and it's more or less almost the same meaning, right? But they, of course, people do not react that way because they think if Google comes in to run your health system, it's a good thing because it improves it and makes it more efficient. So, I can discuss this question of feedback infrastructure, but I think broadly speaking, none of these more specific measures would be doable and plausible until we resolve more fundamental questions. And here you immediately run into the coherence of the European project, into the lack of a coherent fiscal and budgetary strategy, into the perennial disagreements between the Germans and everybody else in Europe. It's tough, but I also think we should not be pretending that these issues are not real. And kind of, because here it's very tempting to just say, well, it's just the corrupt elites, we need to get rid of them and things will fall into place. Or you will just say, well, it's more complicated than that. The factors are much more international than national. They have to do much more with capital than with some kind of technocratic alliances between lobbyists and elites, which clearly is a factor, but that's not the factor.
Well, here we have that debate in these elections. We have a clear message from the parties of the left that were clearly talking about las cloacas del Estado, since they pay like 1.5 million to Facebook to organize the electoral campaign, and now I'm talking about Podemos. We are also seeing some kind of initiatives that were from the Popular Party, like La Tasa Google, that was driven by the main economist of this party. And we are also seeing that the initial propositions of changing the treaties of the European Union, of going out of the euro, or trying to make some radical politics about the debt, disappeared. And in that place, some other assumptions, another discourse, another political message appear. You travel all over Europe and you know the debates better than me, but I would like you to, not to propose, but to delineate some strategical lines about which are the areas or the pillars that you talk about. Now you are talking about taxes. Which are the pillars for a political or a left agenda about not only technology, but also about the structural transformation that we are seeing on the economy, to depart from that populist approach to our problems?
I'm going to give a somewhat disappointing response, I think, or maybe disappointing message, if not the response. I think that there is a cross-party and cross-ideological agenda, which is reasonable, which to some extent, reasonable liberals like Macron and others are now promoting, which is the idea that there are certain crucial steps that Europe needs to take in order to remain competitive vis-a-vis China and the United States. Fine, they frame these issues as a question of European sovereignty, European technological sovereignty, and so forth. And in as far as it goes, I'm on board with that agenda. I would love to see non-commercial, public, giant platforms that produce things. Unfortunately, most likely we'll end up with Airbus-like structures, which will be very big, with tons of public money invested into them, and they will be acting on the global market. Right now, we don't even have them in Europe in the fields like artificial intelligence or big data. I mean, all of these firms are located in Asia, or they're located in the United States. For me, this is the very minimum of what should be done. And if this is not an issue on the political agenda of a party, it means they're not thinking seriously and hard enough about the current international situation and the current trade situation especially. And if you know anything, it's that the trade conflict between the US and China in the last few months is likely to define how both of those countries and all the regions in between are going to develop. In Europe, it's almost like a lost, like few people talk about it, right? And to me, it's a mistake. So I would argue that it's not even a question of left and right anymore. I mean, it's a matter of preserving some space for maneuver on this very issue, where then you can have clearly a much more center-right strategy that would emphasize private enterprise, or more center-left or even radical left strategy that would emphasize the public sector, industrial strategy, coordination, and so forth. But both of them, in as much as you presume that there has to be space for European companies, which almost by rules are prohibited from receiving state aid. Right? How would they compete with Chinese companies which receive billions in public funding for the sole reason of basically eliminating all the other firms? Or how would they compete against startups that are funded by SoftBank, this giant Japanese enterprise, which takes a lot of money from investors like the government of Saudi Arabia, and then it dumps them into companies like Uber. So Uber can afford to lose $4.5 billion, as they did in 2017, and most of their competitors can't. Right? So how long can you stay alive if your closest competitor can lose $5 billion? I mean, most of the European companies won't survive that. And clearly, if we want them to survive that, which is an if, I'm not saying we should, but if we want them to be able to play in that field, we need to have certain measures in place. Beyond that, I think it would all be a question of how much and how fast, since you asked me about the left specifically, how much and how fast the left will be able to understand what its new purpose is. And I think most of the parties that we have now, they are part of the zombie left. I mean, they're not part of the left. It's kind of institutions that have mutated, that have been around for a very long time in many contexts, that can leverage certain local debates and national debates to their advantage temporarily. In the long term, they don't know what they're about, and they don't know how to appeal to people and voters that do not just come from the working background in the factories, right? And if you look at more, and I mean, I'm not saying anything new, you all know that, right? But the inability to go beyond the traditional agenda of, well, we need to make sure that workers get, proportional wage increases every quarter, we'll get such and such work conditions. I mean, it's all interesting, and trade unions have been, of course, institutions that have pushed for that by far. My contention is that in 2019, given the wealth of new possibilities for cooperation, social coordination, innovation as well, that are afforded by information technologies, not having a political agenda that explicitly states that we'd like to put those infrastructures and technologies at the service of the people and at the service of a radical transformative agenda that can allow people to transform their social circumstances and not just to adapt to them, which is how 99% of apps currently work, right? They make it easier for you to fit into the current system without changing anything in the system, but by changing something in yourself. So these apps might monitor that you do not sleep enough or you spend too much money through your phone, so they will tell you have to adjust this, and this. I mean, all these apps do. 99% of the innovation we have now is deeply conservative in its outlook, right? It just seeks to make it easier for us to adapt ourselves to the world around us. It's not a progressive, leftist attitude by any means. It's a very conservative attitude, which basically tells you the world is there, it's not to be changed or altered, you can only adapt to it. Right? It's almost like positive psychology on steroids. Right? What we want is to understand how all these modern technologies can serve the true progressive agenda, which is about empowering people to change the world around them so that they don't have to change themselves. Right? And of course, there are plenty of things that need to be changed in people, chauvinism, all sorts of other problems, xenophobia. I'm not saying that all of us are good as we are, and there are clearly even some behavioral changes that need to happen in many places, but the agenda of let's just focus on the workplace, and let's just focus on the public sector, and let's just leave everything and this question of empowerment unaddressed, to me it seems very narrow, and unless progressive movements and parties wake up to that, it will be appropriated either by the neoliberals or it will be appropriated by the right. I mean, it seems obvious that there is a promise of empowerment inside this information revolution. The problem is that most often it's sold to us as the empowerment that is contained in the logic of the market. Right? That it's not, so when Facebook or Google empowers us, people do not see it as being empowered by information technology. In the neoliberal discourse, they see themselves as being empowered by a corporation, hence the market, hence not by the state. And to me, it's a dead end rhetorically. You will not ever try to imagine other institutions that can empower you if your only binary choice is between the state and between the firm. And I just think it's a very Cold War era thinking. You know, for me, there are plenty of other institutions that can enter the landscape, but we need to kind of nurture them.
We have to think about it and to have a radical agenda, especially to political participation and how a political subject can be more active and more, sometimes even with entrepreneurship. I would like you to answer now that the political debate is conquered by a populist approach to technology that is made by Bolsonaro, by Steve Bannon, but some of the people, even in Italy, from the radical right. Which is the relation that you see in the future after you talk a lot about, or you talked a lot about data extractivism, which when all this data accumulation, or what Morse called primitive accumulation, ends, are we going to be trapped on the platforms of 5-6 people, and this on the side of the economics, but on the side of politics, which is going to be the approach to participation or even to political engagement or our political life. These right-wing movements won the debate. I mean, I would like to be clear, not pessimistic, but to be clear of which is the importance of another kind of progressive thinking enters here to politicize this debate.
Now, what do you think? I mean, I'm getting tired, so maybe I'll make you work also.
Well, I mean, I'm proposing this kind of debate in Spain. You can see with very few successful participation.
They're very committed.
Well, I mean, in the book I get a radical approach, a philosophical approach to this. I think that I don't want to wait until the future comes. For me, the present is catastrophic, and for me, the opportunities behind technologies today, this year, are enough to understand which are the things that we have to fight for. But obviously, that I think that if the centralization of the information and the centralization of power relies on these landlords or on these capitalists or whatever we want to talk them, I mean, it's widely known that the main companies of transportation of the world, of the future of mobility, are going to be Uber and are going to be Lyft. Both of them are very, are property or 2 millionaires of Japan controls them. I mean, we can wait for a future of 2 people getting a lot of profitability from an industry, or we can wait for a future where the transportation helps to some kind of transition to a more ecological approach, or to another kind of understanding mobility on the cities. But I'm really interested on.
Yeah. Well, no, I mean, those are all good questions. I think there are a few things I could respond to even in your question. I don't actually think that Bolsonaro or Salvini make a populistic use of digital media. I mean, to me, you can of course say that they have a very demagogic use of them, in that they say things that are deliberately wrong, or that they say them to provoke and somehow fire up a media discussion, just like Trump does it. But there is no true populism in it, in the sense, at least in which I use the term, meaning that it does not seek to somehow offer a vision for how ordinary citizens can be empowered by those technologies at all, right? And there is no engagement with an alternative paradigm of how information technology can be used for a very different agenda. And I think partly that's our problem, that so many people have been so badly brainwashed by Silicon Valley and its conferences and its podcasts and the people, who continuously kind of celebrate its ideas, that there is almost no possibility to conceive of how a very different world where there is still automation, AI, where there is coordination between people by means of phones, where there are sensors everywhere, how that world can function if it would not be offered by Google or Amazon or Facebook, or by Alibaba or Baidu or Tencent, to take the Chinese firms, right? And I think our problem is precisely inability to conceive of alternative social arrangements of how this can be done. But I think it's not a challenge that's very different from how we used to think of the provision of health or education before the formal emergence of the welfare state. Some of those functions in the late 19th century, for example, in places like Britain or even Germany, they were provided by the church, and maybe to some extent they still are provided by the church in Spain and other countries and the foundations around it. But after some of those functions were centralized and taken over by a professional bureaucratic administration, it became completely normal for us to think of the education system or the health system as something that is and should be in public hands, should be regulated, and so forth. And it became completely normal to think in those terms, and it would be completely inappropriate to think of those terms at the end of the 19th century. Right? So what I'm saying is that we need to be able to unlearn these dominant ways of experiencing the digital economy, try to understand whether treating data, for example, as infrastructure that all of us can own in common and treat as a public good would be better than treating it as an asset class, which is how a lot of investors and people in Davos would like us to think about it. Should we think about it as a commodity which is sold and bought, or should we think about it as some kind of national treasure which should be treated carefully and access to it should be tightly regulated? Those are all, to me, big questions on which there is a lot to be said. Just that the movements that could be and should be saying those things, they're not saying them because they are not interested, perhaps, in taking risky positions and trying to depart from the mainstream talking points which tie to a very banal and mostly theoretical conception of capital and capitalism and the modern state in it. So, for me, it's very hard to understand those leftists that instead of trying to understand how even the welfare state itself can be reinvented by means of AI, how transportation can be reinvented by means of sensors. Clearly you do not want to have a system which dispatches empty buses to empty streets to pick up non-existing customers. It's just bad. Environmentally, it's bad, it's inefficient. And even though you might take some delight in the fact that it's part of the public sector and offered by a publicly run transportation company, it's just a horrible way to administer things in 2019. You can, of course, build a much better system where a bus is available on demand. It does not cost the cost of Uber, it costs much less. You indicate with your phone where you are, it tells you where the nearest stop is, you get picked up, other people get picked up, a route is being developed for that bus, and that bus drives all of you where you need to be, and boom, after 30 minutes you arrive where you need to arrive. It seems to me like a very environmentally sound solution. It will probably be a cheaper one, since that bus will maximize its resources and will not waste a lot of gasoline, and it works only if there are people who are actually willing to travel, right? But it does not work as a service offered to you by SoftBank or Saudi Arabia. It exists and it basically functions as a public good. And in as much as it functions as a public good, and an extension of the traditional welfare institutions, I think it should be welcomed and celebrated. But what are the preconditions for it to be in place? Do we need to have map data that's available for such public initiatives? Do we need to have some kind of AI as a public good, so maybe that car and bus can drive itself? Do we need an infrastructure of sensors that do not belong to Apple or Google, which are also present in our phones? Those are questions which to me are questions of political economy, but they're also questions of political and legal and social imagination, because they require us to imagine what institutions we need to have in place to take full advantage of those technologies, and what kind of funding and other schemes we need to have in place for that to become a reality. And the reality is that for most of the forces on the left and progressive forces that would normally talk about these issues, it's much more convenient to say, well, we need to stop the the transportation system from being defunded. So we just need to keep it as it was built 30 years ago, maybe modernize the seats, and yeah, if it's not broken, why fix it, right? And to me, it's just a very lazy, passive, and kind of uninspiring attitude, which does not even seek to invent anything. It just wants to continue with the institutions that we developed, sometimes in 1930s, sometimes in 1960s, sometimes in 1980s, depending on the context. But are they the best institutions we can build, given what we can be building? I doubt it.
I think that the problem is very clear. For example, in Spain, we have those kind of neoliberals, like Garicano, Arroñadas, propose that really have something to say about technology. They would like to use blockchain in a decentralized way. They would like to break up big tech, and they would like to establish another kind of governance where data or artificial intelligence is a commodity, and you can go to the market with your own data, with your data assets, and be hired by who knows if JP Morgan says. And then we also have some other approach in Spain, a bit more conservative, not as neoliberal, but more grounded on the liberal tradition, who proposed that kind of civil leviathan, and how the state can be reformulated in a way that not in such neoliberal way, but in a far way. And we also have an approach, a more stupid approach, probably the one of the social democrats that are proposing like we can solve all of our problems with better cities and with smart cities. One in Spain, they are called smart cities for tourism. But we do lack a position of the left. We can see that in these elections, we see in the program some kind of a strategy to create a national institute for robotics. They propose some kind of technological sovereignty, but this is not driven by real understanding of which is the influence of Silicon Valley to something as basic as the companies of Spain. 75% of the IBEX 35 companies have their service in 1, 2, or 3 American companies like Microsoft, Google, or Amazon. All our industries are dependent from the services of 3 or 4 big firms of the United States. And also we do not have that clear vision of the coming from the left of which is the problem. But sometimes when you talk with some of the leaders, or when you talk with someone from the left or from a notable voice from the left, they say to you that these are not topics that can articulate hegemonic discourse, or these are not topics that are going to win elections, and these are not topics for television, or that these are not topics that are going to give you votes on an election. So this narrative always obsessed with some kind of an electoral market or always focused on the election, is compatible with articulating a more ambitious, and this could be the end of the event, with a more ambitious approach to the main forces that are driven today, both the main political and economical forces that are now influencing our societies.
Well, I mean, it is compatible, but again, it would require a very different and much deeper conversation about what it means to be left today. And as you might have inferred from what I was saying, for me, it's much more important to be progressive than to be formally of the left, which does not mean that I'm a social democrat of the center left, but it means that there is something about giving people the capacity to transform the environment that is worth recognizing, right, and that's worth celebrating. And I think the problem with a lot of forces on the left is that they have settled on just one single institutional template for how that empowerment is supposed to be delivered. And it's supposed to be delivered primarily by the state itself and by enlightened bureaucrats and technocrats who will manage the innovation process, who will manage healthcare, education, and everything else. And the citizens, are there to occasionally go to the factory, and if they go to the factory, then to freelance, and to, shop at the supermarket. I mean, it's a very boring life, which kind of goes against everything that Karl Marx and others have written about what it means to be a modern, active political subject. And unless you manage to break that completely erroneous picture, right, and kind of resituate the citizen as an active, vibrant political entity that has interests that go beyond just the factory and the supermarket, it will be extremely tough, and I agree, to talk to people about why they need such things, as being able to determine the path of artificial intelligence, or to develop new forms of learning, co-education that go beyond just the formal ways of learning in the classroom. Of course, it's much easier to be saying that, no, we need to defend the schools, we need to make sure we don't cut the budgets. All of that is obvious. The question is whether it's enough and whether it's the best we can deliver given the high technological potential and capacity that we have right now, and whether it's the most democratic empowerment existence where people will not lead completely alienated lives of work and consumption, and whether we can find space for something else. And my fear is that the left stays from these issues for a very good reason. It just has nothing to say on them. And unless it has something to say on them that is worth listening to, maybe it's not even bad that they stay away from them. So, I mean, my answer to you then is that the crisis is much more profound ideologically than just the crisis of their thinking about technology. It's not just about technology, and it's not only about technology. It's not primarily about technology. It's about their inability to articulate a vision of how citizens should relate to each other, how they should relate to the state, and how they should relate to some kind of productive capacities. Whether these people should be do we want to have people who are entrepreneurs, or do we want to have people who work in a factory? Like, I don't know, if you give me that option, I think I'm on the left, but I'd rather prefer to have people who are entrepreneurs. I just don't see anything very good from working in a hierarchical working place with fixed, and sometimes very rigid hours. A lot of people on the left would answer that question differently. They would think that the right place for workers is in the factory, and they should not aspire to some kind of petit bourgeois existence as an entrepreneur, right? And I just think it's wrong, and unless the left recognizes that, they'll be losing the battles to neoliberals, but they're losing spiritual battles. These are not technological battles, right? And unless you manage to present something better than the factory worker, or some kind of a social center radical, or occupant. What is that ideal political identity that the left would like to bestow upon us? And it's not obvious. And unless it becomes obvious, it's pointless to be talking about technology. That's why I talk about it less and less.
I think that it's enough. I would like to thank you all for being here. The conversation or the arguments that have been recorded, and I think that the book, it's obvious that the parts from the work of Evgeny, even if his work is not finished,
Well, hopefully I'm still alive. I'm not planning to retire soon.
So, even if his work is not finished because he didn't publish any book during the last 6 years.
Published some, just not new.
Well, not new, a recollection of articles, apart from some
Sure.
reports about the smart cities. I think that the book tried to politicize these kind of issues. I depart from the work of Evgeny to give another kind, more philosophical, probably more poetical view of how not the left, but the progressive forces which is the vision of the progressive forces today. And I think that this debate contributed to have a clear understanding of which are those structural patterns and which are the things that we should do concretely in Spain to achieve different futures. So thanks all for coming.
Thank you.